Hi, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Dr. Kaplan, and my mission is to make psychology accessible to all. And in today's video, we're going to talk all about phobias. I get the question regularly in my clinical practice. What are phobias? How do we differentiate between fear and phobia? Is it normal that I have this phobia? Things like that. So in this video, I'm going to cover the various forms of phobias. And in the DSM-5, which is the manual we use for diagnosis, there are three conditions that one should pay attention to: specific phobias, social phobias, and agoraphobia. These are the three that we will talk about today. I'll give you a sense of what it looks like for each condition, how we diagnose it, and then at the end, I'll show you a screening instrument that was produced by the American Psychiatric Association. So here we go. The first thing we need to know is, what are phobias? What's the word mean? Well, if we think about the word phobia, it comes from the Greek word for fear. And it is, generally speaking, a persistent or exaggerated or unreasonable fear about an object, activity, or situation. Now, the natural response of a person who's experiencing a phobia is that they typically avoid whatever the trigger is. And we're going to talk about how often people go into therapy, but avoidance is one of the strategies people use. So first things first, I think it's important to note that there is a difference between normal fear and phobias. So everybody might have a specific fear, but that doesn't mean you have a phobia or meet the criteria for a phobic disorder. So how do common fears differ from phobias? Number one, phobias tend to be more intense, far more persistent fear. Number two, with a phobia, people tend to avoid the feared object or situation as much as they can. And number three, if a person cannot avoid the experience when they're undergoing whatever exposure, there is significant distress that interferes with their ability to function. Oh, before I go on, I do want to show this graphic. If you look at it, this was a survey done measuring fears and phobias, and there are a whole bunch of them. They started with things like being alone, all the way to things like blood, heights, and animals. And you could see as we go to the right and things become more of a legitimate evolutionary fear, the natural fear rates go up. But in the teal color, the phobias also go up. So we tend to see a pattern that we have greater phobic reactions based on evolutionary wiring. So we call that more of a preparedness for the condition. So most phobias are labeled as specific phobias. And if you can think of something, there's probably a phobia named after it. So things like being afraid or intense dread of being in confined spaces, we would refer to that as claustrophobia. That imagine yourself in a crowded elevator, that's going to be uncomfortable for many. So people who have a claustrophobia, they will avoid going into elevators for that purpose. We also have cynophobia. Cyno, the root is, again, Greek for dog, phobia, fear. So cynophobia is an extreme fear of dogs. But these are specific phobias. I also mentioned that there are two broader kinds of phobias, something called social anxiety disorder, which you might hear as social phobia, and agoraphobia, which we'll talk about as well. But let's start with a specific phobia. What are the criterion that need to be met in order for a person to be diagnosed with a specific phobia? First, it is a chronic condition. So that means that the person must have this extreme fear for a minimum of 6 months. And that fear qualitatively must be defined as um, disproportionate or exaggerated relative to whatever that object is or whatever the situation is. Now, I mentioned to you that if exposed to that object, they're going to have fear, and they'll go to great lengths to avoid being exposed to the feared situation. And under exposure, there is significant distress or impairment. So let's take the case of arachnophobia, which is a fear of spiders. People get uncomfortable around spiders, and that's perfectly fine. It's evolutionarily appropriate to be afraid of spiders because some are venomous and run risk of causing us death. But many of them are not. So if you had a garden spider in your house, many people just collect it, release it into the wild again. But what happens with a person who darts out of a room, climbs on a table, screams at the top of their lungs? That would be a very disproportionate reaction to a garden spider. So if we look at bullet point 4, that significant distress, that is disproportionate to actually what was presented. Now, you'll see the most common phobias are animals and insects, followed by heights, enclosed spaces, thunderstorms, and blood. All of these trigger a potential threat to one's existence, and therefore, at an exaggerated sense, one can acquire a specific phobia. Now, what is the epidemiology? Epidemiology is kind of the profile, how the relative prevalence in society. Well, phobias tend to be an anxiety condition, which I said anxiety conditions are the most commonly occurring diagnoses in the United States. Phobias, you have about 8.7% of people reporting symptoms of phobias. And across a lifetime, it's about 12%. But that really is an underestimate of what's going on, because many people with phobias, they avoid whatever is distressing and they don't come into therapy. So we estimate it's probably about 1 in 4 or 25% of people would qualify across the lifetime as having a phobic disorder. It is twice as common amongst women. It is more common amongst ethnic minorities. The reasoning for this is unknown to today. Now, the second general class of a phobia is agoraphobia. So agoraphobia is a pronounced or disproportionate fear where a person has anxiety about escaping a situation, or where help is unavailable, or where they might extreme a panic attack that they can become incapacitated or immobilized. So I had a client with agoraphobia, and they would not ride the trains because they said, well, what if the train breaks down and we're stuck in between the tracks and no one's able to get to us? That is a classic example of a person being afraid of public transportation because of not being able to escape. But other forms of situations, and you need at least 2 situations, might be parking lots and bridges, or crowded spaces, shopping theaters, or even leaving home unaccompanied because they might need help or to be rescued. Now, this fear is such that the person's afraid that they cannot escape, or it might be disabling or debilitating for them. So what do? Just like every other phobia, uh, people with agoraphobia avoid agoraphobic situations. So if a person is afraid to get stuck on public transportation or get stuck in an open space, some people with agoraphobia, they don't leave their home, and that's a more extreme scenario. But it is possible that a person can become homebound due to extreme agoraphobia. Uh, this is also a chronic condition, requires a minimum of 6 months of the symptoms to be there, and it has to cause some level of distress or impairment in functioning. So, when does this typically occur? This typically occurs in early adulthood, which is your 20s or 30s, and we tend to see about 2.2% of the adult population tends to report agoraphobia, and women report it twice as commonly as men. So, what are explanations for agoraphobia? Well, many of the explanations are the same as specific phobia. So, people with agoraphobia experience extreme or sudden bouts or bursts or explosions of fear called panic attacks. And when a person develops these panic attacks, it's very unsettling. And many people feel as though they're having a heart attack. And I'm going to have another video where I talk about panic disorder. But these panic attacks are absolutely paralyzing at times. Now, if a person has panic attacks, we can give them simultaneously two diagnoses: agoraphobia and a panic disorder. The last broad type of a phobia is called social anxiety disorder. And you might hear social anxiety disorder described in the public as social phobia. So, what is social anxiety? That is a marked or disproportionate or persistent fear about social situations. So, it could be very narrow in focus, such as writing in public, or eating in public, or performing in public, or it could be more broad in a sense where a person feels so anxious that they, generally speaking, perform poorly in front of others. So they worry about it. Now, what is the fear? It is an irrational fear that they're going to make a fool of themselves, or they're trying to avoid real or imagined embarrassment. So, typically, when a person has a social phobia, they tend to perform more poorly, as I said, than people who do not have a social phobia. All phobias, you'll see, you need 6 months or more. Exposure to a social situation will induce this anxiety or panic state. And as a function of that, people will avoid engaging in whatever social activity that elicits this anxiety. And if you watch Big Bang Theory, I believe, I think it was Raj who was on a date with a young lady, and she had social phobia, and her anxiety got so high that she escaped to the bathroom and climbed out the window and never returned to the table. And that, while being sensational on television, is the reality for some people, that it causes them to avoid even things like dating. So, what is the epidemiology, or the prevalence of social phobias? About 7% of people annually report some form of a social phobia, and about 12% across a lifetime. It's 1.5 times more common amongst women, and Asia African Americans tend to have higher rates of social phobia. Now, Social phobias develop a little bit earlier. We tend to see this happening even as early as adolescence, which makes sense because if we think about the social development of teenagers, one of the challenges is to figure out who they are, or the identity crisis. So that makes sense. Now, one thing that is getting a little more attention is social media jitters. So we started to see more recently technology, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, all of these social media platforms we tend to see can produce anxiety, including social anxiety, or if it's broad enough, generalized anxiety, which we talked about in the previous video. Now, research indicates that about 1/3 of people on Facebook worry about how other people will post or use information that's theirs without their permission. And about 1/4 of people feel a pressure to share information beyond their comfort zone. So social media is now another platform where people are starting to develop a social anxiety. And there's a pressure as to how many likes or comments a person gets. Ironically, I'm going to say if you like this video and like this content, hit the like button. There's a little irony there. Hit the subscribe button, click the notifications icon so you can get more of this content. But this general sense of needing comments and likes is a pressure on our young people today. So the last thing I want to do is I want to share with you a screening instrument that the American Psychiatric Association put together for specific phobias. Okay, so this is the DSM-5. The work group helped to develop a severity measure for specific phobia. This, in particular, we're not talking about agoraphobia necessarily. We're not talking about social phobia necessarily. The focus is on the more broad, specific phobia. So you'll see that while the criteria for a diagnosis of a specific phobia requires 6 months, this is a screening instrument. So we're trying to tap into what are the phobias they're experiencing, and in the last 7 years, how it's impacted them. So you'll see in the top, there is an item that allows them to identify what the phobia is, whether it's driving, flying, going through tunnels or bridges, whether it's animals or insects, whether it's height, blood, needles, vomiting, etc. And then it gives you a series of items such as, and these items are in relation to the criteria for the diagnosis, right? So felt moments of sudden terror, fear, or fright, felt anxious, worried, or nervous in these situations, had thoughts about being injured or overcome with fear, had a racing heart or sweaty palms, etc., felt muscle tension, avoided these situations, moved away from these situations or had to leave them early, put off these situations. So you see all the avoidance that we're talking about. And then after you answer all 10 items, basically we're going to get an average. So we add up each item score and then divide it by however many items they answered. Now, we expect them to answer at least 8 out of 10. If they answer less than 8 out of 10, it really compromises the validity of the instrument. But whatever number of questions they answered, you divide it by. So let's assume that they answered all of the questions and they got a total raw score of 20, but they answered all 10 questions. So 20 divided by 10 would be 2. And that would be our measure. And then the higher the average, the more severe or the more debilitating this phobia is for them. And that's the screening instrument. I like to show you an instrument because as a clinician, I kind of want you to see what we're looking for. Now, as I said, this is my second video. I have a challenge going on, 30 videos in 30 days. So if you like this video, please hit the like button. Please subscribe for additional content. Hit the notifications tab. This does help me in reaching a larger audience and sharing more content like this. I appreciate you indulging me. Have a great day, everybody.